Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. What happens when a civilization begins to look backward instead of forward, and in doing so, quietly changes the future of the world? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, I would love to know where you are listening from tonight. Share your location and your local time in the comments below. There is something comforting in imagining this story unfolding softly across different corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the early 14th century, Europe did not appear to be on the verge of cultural renewal. It was a continent shaped by feudal loyalties, strong religious authority, and a worldview that placed heaven above all earthly concerns. Most people lived in small rural communities. Their days were measured by church bells, seasonal labour, and the expectations of their local lord. Education was limited. Books were rare. Knowledge flowed slowly, carried by handwritten manuscripts and guarded within monasteries and cathedral schools. The intellectual centre of Europe during the High Middle Ages had been theology. Scholars debated the nature of divine grace, the relationship between faith and reason, and the structure of Christian doctrine. Universities had emerged in cities such as Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, but their focus remained primarily on law, medicine, and religious philosophy. The ancient world of Greece and Rome was known, yet it was often filtered through medieval commentary. Classical authors were studied less for their human insight and more for how they could support Christian teaching. Yet beneath this stability, subtle changes were already taking place. Trade routes expanded across the Mediterranean. Italian city-states such as Florence, Venice, and Genoa prospered through commerce. Banking families accumulated wealth not from land, but from financial networks that stretched from London to Constantinople. Urban life grew more complex. A merchant class emerged ambitious, educated, and increasingly independent of feudal structures. Then came a crisis that would unsettle everything. In 1347, ships arrived in the ports of southern Europe, carrying a disease that would soon devastate the continent. The Black Death spread rapidly. Within a few years, it killed perhaps 1/3 of Europe's population. Entire villages were abandoned. Priests, doctors, and labourers alike fell ill. The familiar rhythms of life were broken. The plague did not directly cause the Renaissance, but it altered the balance of society. With so many dead, labour became scarce. Survivors found new economic opportunities. Wages rose in some regions. Serfs negotiated better conditions or moved to towns in search of work. The rigid hierarchies of the medieval world loosened slightly. Authority, once unquestioned, began to face quiet doubt. At the same time, the Church, though still powerful, struggled to provide clear answers to the suffering. The Great Schism of 1378 further weakened its unity, as rival popes claimed legitimacy from Rome and Avignon. For ordinary people, the certainty that had defined earlier generations seemed less secure. Some responded with renewed devotion, others turned toward new forms of inquiry. In the Italian peninsula, political life differed from much of northern Europe. Instead of large, unified kingdoms, Italy consisted of city-states, independent urban republics, and duchies competing for influence. Florence, Milan, Venice, and Rome developed distinct identities. Their wealth came from trade, textile production, and finance. Their leaders were merchants, bankers, and nobles whose status depended not only on inheritance, but on skill and calculation. Florence in particular became a place where civic pride and competition encouraged innovation. Its citizens valued public display, grand buildings, impressive artworks, and visible signs of prosperity. Guilds regulated trade and sponsored construction projects. Political power shifted among families, yet participation in government was broader than in many monarchies. It was in this environment that a new intellectual mood began to take shape. Some scholars started to read ancient Roman texts not merely as authorities on doctrine, but as voices speaking across centuries. They admired the clarity of Cicero's Latin, the moral reflections of Seneca, and the historical narratives of Livy. These works seemed grounded in human experience rather than solely in theology. One figure often associated with this shift was Francesco Petrarca, known as Petrarch. Born in 1304, he devoted himself to collecting and studying classical manuscripts. He wrote letters addressed to ancient authors as though they were living companions. To him, the past was not a distant shadow but a conversation partner. He believed that the moral and literary achievements of Rome could inspire renewal in his own time. This approach gradually formed the foundation of what would be called humanism. Humanists did not reject religion. Most remained devout Christians, but they placed greater emphasis on human agency, classical education, and the study of language, history, and ethics. They believed that by understanding the achievements of antiquity, individuals could cultivate virtue and civic responsibility. While scholars re-examined texts, artists began to reconsider how they represented the visible world. Medieval art had often emphasized symbolic meaning. Figures appeared stylized, flat, and hierarchical in scale. Gold backgrounds suggested heavenly space rather than earthly depth. Now, painters experimented with perspective, shading, and proportion. They observed how light fell across surfaces and how bodies occupied space. This transformation did not occur suddenly. It unfolded gradually as artists learned from one another and studied remnants of classical sculpture. They examined Roman ruins scattered across the Italian landscape. Broken columns, arches, and statues hinted at an earlier civilization that had valued symmetry and balance. Architects began to measure these remains carefully, seeking mathematical harmony. Economic forces supported these changes. Wealthy families commissioned paintings and buildings not only for churches but for private homes and civic spaces. Art became a means of expressing status and devotion simultaneously. Competition among patrons encouraged higher standards and bold experimentation. Meanwhile, trade brought more than goods. It carried ideas from the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. Greek scholars, especially after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, migrated westward, bringing manuscripts and linguistic expertise. This influx enriched the study of ancient Greek texts in Italy. Plato, long overshadowed by Aristotle in medieval scholasticism, found new readers. The Renaissance, though often associated with brilliance and creativity, emerged from practical concerns as much as inspiration. City-states needed skilled administrators. Courts required diplomats who could write persuasive letters in refined Latin. Merchants depended on mathematical knowledge. Education adapted to these needs, emphasizing rhetoric, grammar, and classical models. By the 15th century, the term rinascita, meaning rebirth, began to circulate among Italian writers. They believed they were recovering something that had been neglected. Yet they did not simply copy the past. They reshaped it. Classical forms were adapted to Christian themes. Ancient myths appeared alongside biblical narratives in frescoes and sculptures. Beyond Italy, change moved more slowly at first. Northern Europe retained stronger feudal traditions and different artistic styles. Still, trade networks connected these regions. Flemish painters developed detailed oil techniques. Scholars in France, Germany, and England corresponded with Italian humanists. The Renaissance was not a single event, but a long process stretching from the 14th to the 17th century. It unfolded unevenly across regions. Some cities flourished while others declined. Wars between Italian states and later invasions by foreign powers disrupted stability. Yet, even conflict could spread artistic and intellectual ideas as displaced artists carried their skills elsewhere. The political landscape also shifted. Powerful families like the Medici in Florence used patronage strategically. By funding libraries, churches, and academies, they reinforced both civic identity and personal authority. Cultural investment became a form of political influence. In daily life, most people remained farmers or artisans. The Renaissance did not immediately transform their routines. Yet urban centres offered new possibilities. Apprentices trained in workshops. Students attended universities. Literacy slowly increased among the middle classes. As the 15th century progressed, a sense of confidence grew in certain circles. Artists signed their works more frequently, asserting individual authorship. Architects designed buildings inspired by Roman temples but adapted to contemporary needs. Scholars edited and printed texts with increasing accuracy. The medieval world had emphasized continuity and tradition. The emerging Renaissance spirit introduced a measured curiosity about change. It asked whether ancient wisdom could illuminate present problems. It valued observation and experience alongside inherited authority. By the early 16th century, Europe was visibly different from the world of 1300. Cities expanded, courts displayed refined culture, education broadened beyond clerical training. A growing number of individuals believed that human effort could shape destiny within the bounds of faith. Yet this confidence would soon encounter new challenges: religious division, scientific controversy, and global expansion. The Renaissance, at its beginning, was a quiet turning of attention, from heaven alone to the world below, from tradition alone to inquiry. In that turning, something steady and enduring began to form. A culture that looked back to Rome and Athens found itself moving toward modernity, often without fully realizing it. Florence's intellectual circles and artistic workshops represented only a small portion of its population. Most people experienced the Renaissance not as a philosophical movement, but as a gradual change in the texture of daily life. The streets were busy from early morning. Bakers opened shutters before sunrise. The smell of fresh bread mixed with smoke from hearth fires. Merchants arranged goods beneath wooden awnings. Apprentices swept thresholds and prepared tools. Food varied by wealth and region. In Italian cities, bread formed the foundation of most meals. It was often made from wheat in prosperous areas, while poorer households relied on darker grains such as barley or rye. Olive oil replaced butter in much of the peninsula. Beans, onions, cabbage and lentils were common. Seasonal vegetables shaped the rhythm of cooking. Markets reflected what the countryside could supply at that moment. Meat was less frequent for ordinary families. When it appeared, it was usually pork or salted fish. Wealthier households consumed beef, game, and imported spices. Sugar, once rare, became increasingly available through Mediterranean trade. Banquets in elite homes displayed abundance: roasted meats, sweet pastries, fruit preserves, while servants and labourers ate more modestly. Wine accompanied nearly every meal, often diluted with water. Clean drinking water was not always reliable in crowded cities, so wine served both social and practical purposes. In taverns, citizens gathered after work to exchange news. These establishments functioned as informal centres of conversation, where merchants discussed trade, artisans debated guild matters, and travellers shared stories from distant regions. Clothing signalled social position clearly. Sumptuary laws regulated what fabrics and colours different classes could wear. Silk, velvet, and bright dyes indicated wealth. Wool dominated the wardrobes of artisans and labourers. Tailors adjusted garments to contemporary styles, which changed gradually as contact with other regions increased. In Florence, long gowns with fitted sleeves and carefully tailored doublets became fashionable among the prosperous. Homes reflected similar distinctions. Wealthy families lived in stone palazzi built around central courtyards. These residences contained painted walls, carved furniture, and decorative textiles. In contrast, most urban dwellers occupied smaller apartments above shops or within crowded neighbourhoods. Wooden beams supported upper floors. Rooms were multi-purpose, serving as sleeping, cooking, and working spaces. Lighting came primarily from candles or oil lamps. After sunset, streets grew quieter. Nighttime travel required caution, though city authorities attempted to maintain order. Watchmen patrolled districts, and gates were sometimes closed at specific hours. Education expanded gradually during this period. Sons of merchants often attended grammar schools, where they studied Latin texts and arithmetic. Girls received more limited formal education, though some wealthy families ensured their daughters learned reading and writing. Convents offered opportunities for female literacy, especially in regions where dowries determined marriage prospects. Marriage itself functioned as both personal and economic arrangement. Families negotiated contracts carefully. Dowries influenced alliances between households. Weddings were public events marked by feasting and display. Once married, women managed domestic affairs, oversaw servants when available, and contributed to family businesses. In artisan households, wives frequently participated in production and sales. Childhood was shaped by apprenticeship. Boys as young as 12 entered workshops to learn trades, painting, metalwork, weaving, or banking. Masters provided instruction in exchange for labour. Apprenticeship agreements could last several years. The workshop became both workplace and school, transmitting technical skills and professional habits. Religious life remained central. Church attendance structured the week. Feast days punctuated the calendar with processions, music, and communal gatherings. Saints' days offered moments of celebration amid routine labour. Even humanists who admired classical literature maintained devotional practices. Public squares served as stages for civic identity. Markets, festivals, and announcements took place there. During carnival season, masks and performances transformed familiar spaces. Theatre and street entertainment provided diversion. Travelling performers enacted stories drawn from biblical themes or classical myths. Music accompanied many aspects of life. Lutes, recorders, and early keyboard instruments sounded in homes and courts. Sacred choral music filled cathedrals. Composers experimented with harmony and polyphony, creating layered textures that reflected the era's interest in order and proportion. Hygiene practices varied. Public bathhouses existed in some cities, though their popularity fluctuated due to concerns about disease. Private washing was common but limited by available water and heating methods. Herbal remedies and household medical knowledge addressed minor ailments. Physicians, trained at universities, treated wealthier patients using theories inherited from ancient and medieval sources. Travel, while slower than in later centuries, became more frequent among merchants and diplomats. Roads connected major cities, though journeys could be uncomfortable. Inns offered lodging, and letters carried news across regions. Courier systems improved gradually, enabling more reliable communication. Books remained valuable objects, but the introduction of printing in the mid-15th century began to change access. Printed pamphlets and devotional texts appeared in greater numbers. Literacy among urban populations increased slowly. Reading was often communal, with one individual reading aloud to others. In rural areas, daily routines followed agricultural cycles. Planting and harvest determined labour intensity. Villages retained traditional structures longer than cities. Yet even there, market towns connected peasants to broader economic shifts. Demand for wool and grain influenced cultivation choices. Leisure existed alongside labour. Board games, storytelling, and seasonal fairs offered recreation. Hunting remained a pastime for nobles. Urban youth engaged in ball games and contests. Public celebrations marked significant events, including political victories and religious observances. Diet began to diversify further in the late 15th and 16th centuries as global exploration introduced new products. Spices became more accessible. Eventually, foods such as tomatoes and maize entered European cuisine, though their widespread adoption took time. Social mobility, while limited, was not impossible. Successful merchants could elevate family status through wealth and patronage. Education provided opportunities for advancement within government or church positions. Yet hierarchy remained visible in clothing, housing, and legal privileges. Guilds regulated professional life. They controlled quality standards, training, and pricing. Membership offered protection and community. Processions displayed guild banners, reinforcing identity within the city. Disease remained a recurring concern. Plague outbreaks returned periodically, though less devastating than in the 14th century. Households prepared for illness with stored remedies and spiritual precautions. Mortality rates remained higher than in modern times, shaping attitudes toward family and faith. Urban planning improved gradually. Some cities paved streets and developed rudimentary sanitation systems. Fountains provided public water sources. Architectural renovations reflected civic pride, as governments invested in public buildings and infrastructure. In courts beyond Florence, life followed different rhythms. Nobles engaged in diplomacy, hunting, and elaborate ceremonies. Castiglione's Book of the Courtier described ideals of refined behaviour, graceful conversation, musical ability, and cultivated appearance. Such expectations shaped aristocratic habits. Across Europe, climate fluctuations influenced harvests and food supply. The later 16th century experienced cooler temperatures associated with the Little Ice Age. Poor harvests could lead to higher prices and hardship among the poor. Yet daily life was not defined solely by difficulty. Family gatherings, religious festivals, and shared meals provided stability. Craftsmanship flourished in workshops producing textiles, metal goods, and artworks that circulated across regions. By the 17th century, the habits formed during the Renaissance had reshaped European society. Urban centres were more literate, more commercially connected, and more culturally ambitious than their medieval predecessors. Ordinary people did not speak of living in a rebirth. They experienced gradual adjustments, new foods, new books, new fashions, new opportunities. The Renaissance was not confined to studios and libraries. It existed in kitchens scented with herbs, in apprentices bent over tools, in marketplaces where coins changed hands. Its influence unfolded quietly within routines repeated each day, shaping the texture of European life without announcing itself. Florence's prosperity in the 15th century rested not only on merchants and guilds, but on families who understood how wealth could be transformed into influence. Among them, the Medici rose with particular skill. Their ascent did not begin with titles or military conquest. It began with banking careful loans, discreet negotiations, and a network of branches stretching across Europe. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici laid the foundation in the early 1400s. His bank managed accounts for the papacy, giving the family both profit and prestige. Unlike many nobles, the Medici cultivated a modest public image. Giovanni avoided overt displays of dominance. He supported charitable works and contributed to public building projects. In doing so, he positioned his family as benefactors rather than rulers. His son, Cosimo de' Medici, inherited both wealth and strategy. Cosimo understood that power in Florence required balance. The city remained officially a republic, with offices rotated among eligible citizens. Openly seizing control would provoke resistance. Instead, Cosimo operated through alliances and patronage. He funded churches, monasteries, and libraries. He supported scholars who advanced humanist learning. His generosity created loyalty that translated quietly into political stability. Cosimo's exile in 1433 revealed how fragile this balance could be. Rival factions accused him of overreach and forced him to leave the city. Yet within a year, public support secured his return. The episode demonstrated that influence built through patronage could outweigh formal authority. Upon his return, Cosimo governed cautiously, rarely holding office himself but guiding decisions from behind the scenes. Under his leadership, Florence became a centre of artistic experimentation. Cosimo financed the reconstruction of the convent of San Marco, commissioning Fra Angelico to paint frescoes that combined spiritual devotion with renewed attention to perspective and proportion. He established the Medici Library, collecting manuscripts from across Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. Scholars gathered to study texts in Greek and Latin, deepening the city's intellectual resources. The relationship between patron and artist shaped Renaissance production. Commissions specified themes, sizes, and materials, yet within these constraints, artists explored new techniques. Donatello's sculptures for Medici commissions demonstrated both classical influence and personal interpretation. Brunelleschi's architectural designs reflected mathematical precision supported by wealthy sponsors. After Cosimo's death in 1464, his son Piero continued the family's role, though with less resilience. It was Piero's son, Lorenzo de' Medici, later known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, who embodied the cultural ambition of the period. Born in 1449, Lorenzo combined political awareness with literary interest. He wrote poetry in Italian and Latin. He corresponded with scholars across Europe. Under his guidance, Florence reached a peak of artistic brilliance. Lorenzo's court attracted young talents, including Michelangelo, whom he supported during his early development. The Medici Palace became a meeting place for poets, philosophers, and painters. Discussions ranged from Platonic philosophy to civic duty. Cultural achievement enhanced the city's prestige and reinforced Medici authority. Yet Florence's stability faced external pressures. The Italian peninsula remained divided among competing states. Milan, Venice, Naples, and the Papal States pursued their own interests. Diplomacy and shifting alliances characterized politics. Lorenzo engaged in careful negotiation to preserve balance among these powers. In 1478, a conspiracy known as the Pazzi Plot disrupted Florence. Rival bankers, supported by elements within the papacy, attempted to assassinate Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano during a cathedral service. Giuliano was killed. Lorenzo survived with injuries. The event exposed the risks of concentrated influence. Public reaction favoured the Medici, and Lorenzo consolidated his position further. Beyond Florence, Renaissance culture spread through patronage systems in other courts. In Urbino, Federico da Montefeltro created a refined environment where art and scholarship flourished. In Mantua, the Gonzaga family sponsored painters such as Andrea Mantegna. Each court developed distinct preferences while sharing a commitment to classical revival. Rome, long marked by instability, experienced renewal under ambitious popes. Sixtus IV and later Julius II commissioned major building projects. They sought to restore Rome's grandeur, linking papal authority to the memory of imperial antiquity. The Vatican became a stage for artistic innovation, drawing talent from across Italy. The Medici influence extended beyond Florence when Giovanni de' Medici became Pope Leo X in 1513. His election demonstrated how financial networks and cultural reputation could translate into ecclesiastical authority. As Pope, Leo I continued patronage of the arts, supporting projects that shaped the High Renaissance. However, economic challenges emerged. Banking operations faced setbacks due to political instability and unpaid loans from monarchs. The Medici Bank declined in strength during the late 15th century. Financial strain intersected with political tension, weakening the family's position. In 1494, after Lorenzo's death, French forces under Charles VIII invaded Italy, disrupting the balance of power. Florence expelled the Medici temporarily. The Dominican preacher Girolamo Savonarola gained influence, calling for moral reform and criticizing perceived excesses of Renaissance culture. His sermons attracted large audiences. Public burnings of luxury goods signaled a shift in mood. Savonarola's authority proved short-lived. Political and ecclesiastical opposition led to his execution in 1498. Florence returned to republican governance for a time, though instability persisted. The Medici eventually regained control in 1512 with Spanish support, illustrating how international conflicts shaped Italian affairs. Throughout these upheavals, artistic production continued. Even during political uncertainty, commissions moved forward. Workshops adapted to changing patrons. The relationship between culture and power remained intertwined. Patronage was not limited to elites. Guilds, confraternities, and civic institutions also sponsored works. Public art reinforced shared identity. Frescoes in council chambers depicted historical scenes that affirmed republican values. The structure of patronage influenced artistic content. Religious themes dominated, yet classical mythology appeared increasingly in private settings. Wealthy patrons displayed mythological paintings in domestic spaces, signalling education and sophistication. Outside Italy, monarchs observed these developments. French and Spanish rulers invited Italian artists to their courts. Renaissance aesthetics crossed borders through travel and diplomacy. Architectural styles and artistic techniques spread gradually northward. The economic system supporting patronage relied on expanding trade networks. Florentine merchants engaged in textile production that required raw materials from England and dyes from the Mediterranean. Banking facilitated international commerce, linking cultural production to broader economic currents. As the 16th century advanced, patronage shifted towards centralized monarchies. Kings in France and Spain sponsored large-scale projects that reflected national ambition. Yet the model established in Florence, where cultural investment enhanced political authority, remained influential. The Medici story illustrates how private wealth could reshape public life. Their influence did not eliminate conflict, nor did it guarantee lasting stability. But through libraries, churches, and workshops, they fostered conditions in which artists and scholars could experiment. By the early 17th century, Florence's prominence had diminished compared to emerging powers in northern Europe. Still, the patterns established during Medici dominance, strategic patronage, civic art, intellectual networks continued to shape European culture. The Renaissance was not solely the achievement of isolated geniuses. It depended on systems of support, negotiation, and calculated generosity. Families like the Medici transformed financial success into cultural leadership. In doing so, they helped define how art, scholarship, and politics could reinforce one another within an evolving European world. By the early 15th century, painting in Italy began to look different from what earlier generations had known. Medieval artists had conveyed sacred stories with clarity and devotion, yet their figures often seemed suspended in patterned space, defined more by symbolism than by physical presence. Now, painters turned their attention to how bodies occupied rooms, how light fell across fabric, and how architecture could frame a scene with measurable depth. One of the earliest signs of this transition appeared in the work of Giotto di Bondone in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. Though he belonged to an earlier generation, his frescoes in Padua suggested solidity and emotional restraint rather than decorative abstraction. Figures stood firmly on ground planes. Drapery followed the weight of the body beneath. His influence lingered for decades. In Florence, during the early 1400s, Masaccio carried these developments further. Working in the Brancacci chapel, he applied linear perspective to create the illusion of three-dimensional space on a flat surface. Lines converged toward a single vanishing point. Viewers standing before his frescoes experienced a convincing depth that drew the eye inward. His figures possessed weight and proportion derived from observation. Perspective itself emerged through experimentation. Filippo Brunelleschi conducted studies using mirrors and painted panels to test geometric principles. He demonstrated that mathematical rules could organize visual space. Leon Battista Alberti later described these principles in his treatise on painting, providing theoretical structure to what artists practiced in workshops. This new attention to space altered composition. Backgrounds shifted from symbolic goldfields to architectural interiors and natural landscapes. Hills receded into distance through atmospheric perspective, with colours fading into softer tones. Sky replaced patterned backdrop. The world depicted on walls and panels began to resemble the one viewers inhabited. Sculpture underwent parallel changes. Donatello's works displayed anatomical accuracy informed by direct study. His marble figures conveyed individual character rather than generalized types. In his reliefs, shallow carving created subtle gradations of depth, known as rilievo schiacciato. This technique allowed sculptors to suggest space with minimal projection. Artists also examined surviving classical statues. Excavations in Rome uncovered fragments of ancient art. These pieces revealed balanced poses and natural proportions. The contrapposto stance, with weight shifted onto one leg, gave figures a sense of movement and stability combined. Renaissance sculptors adapted this posture to Christian subjects. The materials of art expanded. Oil painting, refined in Northern Europe, gradually entered Italian practice. Oil allowed richer colour transitions and slower drying times, enabling detailed layering. Tempera remained common, but experimentation continued. Workshops organised artistic training systematically. Masters oversaw apprentices who ground pigments, prepared panels and copied drawings. Skills were transmitted through repetition and correction. Guild regulations defined standards and protected professional reputation. Commissions came from churches, confraternities, and private patrons. Altarpieces remained central, yet their composition evolved. Figures interacted within unified spaces rather than occupying isolated compartments. Narrative scenes unfolded with spatial coherence. Religious themes retained importance. The Virgin Mary, saints, and biblical episodes dominated commissions. Yet representation emphasized humanity. Expression suggested quiet reflection or measured sorrow rather than exaggerated gesture. Artists aimed to balance devotion with realism. As the 15th century advanced, experimentation accelerated. Andrea del Verrocchio combined sculpture and painting in his workshop, where Leonardo da Vinci trained. Verrocchio's bronze works demonstrated refined surface treatment and careful attention to anatomy. Piero della Francesca explored geometry in both painting and theoretical writing. His works displayed clarity and calm arrangement. Figures stood within architectural settings constructed through precise perspective grids. Light appeared consistent and rational. The competition between artists encouraged technical advancement. Civic pride motivated cities to commission impressive works. Public monuments commemorated leaders and victories. Portraiture gained prominence as individuals sought to record their likeness with dignity. Portrait painting shifted from profile views, reminiscent of ancient coins, to three-quarter perspectives that suggested psychological presence. Patrons requested accurate representation of facial features and clothing. Such images reflected growing interest in individual identity. Architectural design paralleled developments in painting. Brunelleschi's dome for Florence Cathedral represented an engineering solution to a long-standing problem. The cathedral's vast crossing required a structure spanning unprecedented width without traditional support. Brunelleschi devised a double-shell dome using herringbone brick patterns. His achievement combined study of Roman precedents with innovative construction methods. Buildings designed during this period emphasized symmetry and proportion. Columns, pilasters, and arches referenced classical forms. Facades displayed measured intervals rather than elaborate ornament. Interior spaces aimed for harmonious geometry. Leon Battista Alberti contributed theoretical reflection. His treatises on painting and architecture articulated principles derived from antiquity. He described beauty as arising from mathematical relationships among parts. His writings influenced architects across Italy. By the late 15th century, these developments culminated in what later historians would call the High Renaissance. Artists sought balanced composition, idealized anatomy, and controlled perspective. The goal was unity within complexity. In Florence and Rome, painters such as Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael emerged as leading figures. Each approached art differently, yet all benefited from earlier experiments in perspective and anatomy. Leonardo investigated light and shadow with subtlety. His technique of sfumato softened transitions between tones, creating atmospheric depth. Michelangelo's sculptural training informed his painted figures, which appeared powerful and grounded. Raphael integrated compositional clarity with graceful expression. Artistic innovation did not occur in isolation. Scientific curiosity supported it. Study of anatomy through dissection improved understanding of musculature. Observation of nature encouraged accurate rendering of plants and landscapes. Patronage shaped subject matter. Papal commissions in Rome encouraged grand fresco cycles. Julius II hired Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, combining biblical narrative with monumental scale. Raphael's School of Athens depicted classical philosophers within a coherent architectural space, reflecting humanist admiration for antiquity. Meanwhile, in Venice, artists such as Giovanni Bellini and later Titian emphasized color and atmospheric light. Venetian painting developed distinct qualities influenced by maritime trade and exposure to different pigments. The Renaissance transformation of art represented a shift in how Europeans saw themselves. Images suggested that the human body possessed dignity and structure worthy of careful study. Space became measurable rather than symbolic. Architecture reflected rational order. These changes unfolded over decades through workshops, debates, and commissions. They were not abrupt replacements of medieval art, but gradual developments building upon existing traditions. By the early 16th century, visitors travelling through Italian cities encountered churches and palaces that embodied a new visual language. Frescoes appeared as windows into believable spaces. Sculptures stood independently rather than attached to walls. Buildings conveyed proportion rooted in classical precedent. The awakening of art during the Renaissance rested on curiosity disciplined by method. Artists measured, calculated, and observed. Patrons funded and directed. The result was a visual culture that would influence Europe for centuries. By the late 15th century, the artistic experiments of Florence and Rome had produced individuals whose reputations extended far beyond their home cities. Among them, Leonardo da Vinci stood out not only for technical ability but for the breadth of his curiosity. Born in 1452 inches, the Tuscan town of Vinci, he entered the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio as a young apprentice. There he learned drawing, painting, metalwork, and mechanical skills. From the beginning, his interests moved beyond the boundaries of any single craft. Leonardo approached painting as an investigation. He filled notebooks with observations about light, shadow, and proportion. He dissected human bodies to understand muscles and bone structure. He sketched plants, water currents, and machines. His handwriting ran from right to left in mirror script, perhaps for privacy or habit. These notebooks reveal a mind constantly examining the visible world. In Milan, under the patronage of Ludovico Sforza, Leonardo produced works that combined artistic composition with scientific study. His Last Supper, painted in the refectory of Santa Maria della Grazia, arranged the apostles in balanced groups along a single perspective line. The vanishing point lay behind Christ's head, guiding the viewer's attention through geometry rather than ornament. Each figure responded individually to the moment depicted, reflecting Leonardo's interest in psychology. Yet Leonardo's projects often remained unfinished. His restless curiosity drew him toward engineering designs, canal systems, and studies of flight. He sketched machines for war and peace alike. Some were impractical, others visionary. Though many of these inventions were never built, they reveal how Renaissance art and science overlapped. In Florence, and later in Rome, Michelangelo Buonarroti pursued a different path. Born in 1475, he trained briefly in the Medici garden, studying classical sculptures. His early Pietà in Rome displayed mastery of marble, combining anatomical precision with calm expression. Unlike Leonardo, Michelangelo focused intensely on the human form as the primary vehicle of meaning. When commissioned to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, Michelangelo approached the vast surface as a sculptor working in colour. The figures he created appeared muscular and monumental, arranged within architectural frameworks. Scenes from Genesis unfolded across the ceiling, linking biblical narrative with classical proportion. The scale of the project required sustained labour over several years. Michelangelo's David, carved from a single block of marble, stood as a civic symbol in Florence. The statue's balanced stance and concentrated gaze conveyed controlled strength. Placed originally in a public square, it represented the city's identity during uncertain political times. Raphael, younger than both Leonardo and Michelangelo, offered yet another approach. Born in Urbino in 1483, he absorbed influences from both Florence and Rome. His compositions emphasized clarity and harmony. In the Vatican stands, he painted frescoes that combined classical philosophy with Christian theology. The school of Athens brought together figures such as Plato and Aristotle within a grand architectural setting. The arrangement reflected intellectual balance rather than dramatic intensity. These three figures are often grouped as representatives of the High Renaissance. Their works displayed technical mastery and compositional unity. However, their careers unfolded within networks of patronage and political context. Papal ambitions, courtly expectations, and civic pride shaped what they produced. Beyond Italy, Renaissance ideas adapted to local traditions. In Northern Europe, artists developed detailed realism using oil techniques refined in the Low Countries. Albrecht Dürer of Nuremberg travelled to Italy and absorbed perspective theory. Upon returning north, he combined Italian compositional structure with German attention to surface detail. His engravings circulated widely, demonstrating how printmaking expanded artistic influence. Printing transformed the distribution of images and ideas. Woodcuts and engravings allowed artworks to reach audiences far from their origin. Artists became known through reproductions. Knowledge of perspective and anatomy spread through illustrated treatises. The expansion of learning also influenced science. Nicolaus Copernicus, a Polish scholar educated in Italy, proposed a heliocentric model of the cosmos in the early 16th century. His argument that the Earth moved around the Sun challenged established astronomical systems derived from antiquity and medieval commentary. Though initially circulated among specialists, his work marked a shift in how nature could be understood. Andreas Vesalius published detailed anatomical studies based on direct dissection, correcting long-standing errors in medical texts. Observation began to replace unquestioned reliance on authority. This approach paralleled artistic study of the body. Political developments affected cultural centres. The Italian Wars, beginning in 1494, brought French and Spanish armies into the peninsula. Cities changed hands. Rome was sacked in 1527 by imperial troops, disrupting artistic production temporarily. Many artists dispersed, carrying techniques to other regions. In Venice, relative stability allowed continued experimentation. Giorgione and Titian explored colour and mood. Venetian painters emphasised rich pigments and atmospheric effects rather than strict linear design. Trade connections provided access to materials and influenced stylistic choices. The Renaissance was not solely about grand commissions. Portraiture expanded among merchants and officials who wished to record their status. Artists studied facial expression carefully, presenting individuals as distinct personalities. Architecture evolved alongside painting and sculpture. Donato Bramante designed St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, drawing upon classical forms at monumental scale. His plans influenced subsequent architects even as modifications occurred. Education continued to reflect humanist priorities. Grammar schools emphasized classical texts. Universities incorporated new scientific discussions gradually. Scholars corresponded across borders, forming networks of exchange. As the 16th century progressed, artistic style began to shift again. Mannerism emerged, characterized by elongated proportions and complex compositions. This development reflected both admiration for high Renaissance masters and desire to experiment beyond established balance. Meanwhile, global exploration altered European awareness. Voyages to the Americas and around Africa introduced new commodities and perspectives. Wealth from colonial trade financed artistic projects in Spain and Portugal. In France, King Francis I invited Leonardo to his court, demonstrating how Renaissance culture crossed national boundaries. Italian architects and artists worked in French chateaux, blending styles. England absorbed Renaissance ideas more gradually. Scholars such as Thomas More engaged with humanist thought. Later in the century, playwrights including William Shakespeare would reflect classical themes within vernacular drama. The Renaissance's artistic flowering thus unfolded within interconnected developments: scientific inquiry, political rivalry, economic expansion, and technological change. Individual masters achieved distinction, yet their achievements depended on systems of support and circulation. By the mid-16th century, Europe's cultural landscape differed markedly from that of 2 centuries earlier. Images conveyed spatial realism, books circulated widely, scientific ideas began to question inherited cosmologies. Leonardo's notebooks, Michelangelo's sculptures, Raphael's frescoes. These were visible signs of broader transformation. They represented a belief that disciplined study of nature and antiquity could yield refined expression. As wars and religious tensions intensified later in the century, Renaissance ideals would encounter new pressures. Yet the foundations laid during this period, methodical observation, classical reference, cultivated patronage, remained embedded in European culture. While painters and sculptors refined visual language, another development quietly altered the structure of knowledge itself. In the middle of the 15th century, a metalworker from Mainz named Johannes Gutenberg adapted existing technologies, movable type, oil-based ink, and the screw press into a system capable of producing books in large numbers with consistent accuracy. His printed Bible, completed around 1455, demonstrated that texts could be reproduced more efficiently than by hand copying. Before printing, manuscripts were labour-intensive. Scribes in monasteries or urban workshops copied texts line by line. Errors accumulated over generations of copying. Books were expensive and relatively scarce. With the printing press, identical copies could be produced in hundreds. Costs gradually decreased, access widened. Printing did not immediately replace manuscript culture. For decades, scribes and printers operated side by side, yet the press changed expectations. Readers began to assume stable texts. Scholars could reference page numbers that corresponded across copies. Standardization encouraged comparison and correction. Humanist scholars benefited greatly. Classical works recovered in Italy could now circulate across Europe. Editions of Cicero, Virgil, and Plato appeared in multiple cities. Printers in Venice, such as Aldus Manutius, specialized in compact, affordable editions of Greek and Latin authors. His italic typeface and portable book format made learning more accessible to traveling scholars. The spread of print also strengthened vernacular languages. Bibles, devotional works, and literature appeared in German, French, English, and Spanish. As printers sought markets, they responded to local demand. Literacy expanded among urban populations, who could now purchase books at lower prices. Religious life felt the impact directly. In 1517, Martin Luther, a German monk and professor, published his 95 theses criticizing certain church practices. Printed pamphlets carried his arguments rapidly across the Holy Roman Empire and beyond. Within months, debates that might once have remained local became international. The Reformation that followed reshaped Europe's religious map. Protestant communities formed in Germany, Switzerland, England, and Scandinavia. Catholic authorities responded with reform efforts of their own, known as the Counter-Reformation. The Council of Trent clarified doctrine and addressed abuses. New religious orders, such as the Jesuits, emphasized education and missionary work. Printing amplified these developments. Sermons, catechisms, and polemical tracts circulated widely. Literacy gained practical urgency. Families sought access to scripture in their own language. Schools expanded in Protestant regions to support reading. Scientific inquiry also relied increasingly on print. Copernicus's heliocentric treatise, published in 1543, reached scholars beyond Poland. Though controversial, it initiated conversations that would continue for generations. Later, Galileo Galilei used printed dialogue to defend telescopic observations supporting heliocentrism. His works provoked ecclesiastical opposition but demonstrated how print could sustain debate. The press facilitated exchange between regions. Scholars corresponded by letter and published findings in books that travelled along trade routes. Knowledge accumulated more visibly than before. Errors could be challenged through comparison of sources. Meanwhile, political authorities recognized print's influence. Monarchs issued decrees controlling presses within their territories. Licensing systems sought to regulate content. Yet, underground printing persisted in times of tension. Education adapted to the new environment. Universities expanded curricula to include printed textbooks. Grammar schools used standardized editions of classical authors. Students could own personal copies rather than relying solely on shared manuscripts. The visual arts responded as well. Engravings and woodcuts reproduced paintings and sculptures, extending artists' reputations. Albrecht Dürer's prints circulated across Europe, establishing him as an international figure. Reproductive prints allowed motifs to travel between workshops. Maps benefited from printing technology. As explorers returned with new information, cartographers incorporated findings into printed atlases. Geographic knowledge improved incrementally. The world appeared larger and more interconnected. In daily life, printed materials entered households gradually. Almanacs provided calendars and practical advice. Prayer books guided devotion. Ballads and pamphlets offered entertainment and news. Information moved with greater speed than in previous centuries. The economic implications were significant. Printing houses required investment in type, paper, and skilled labour. Cities such as Venice, Antwerp, and Lyon became centres of the book trade. International fairs facilitated exchange of printed goods. The Renaissance emphasis on returning to original sources gained strength through print. Scholars compared editions, corrected translations, and debated interpretation. Textual criticism developed into a method grounded in evidence, rather than tradition alone. Artistic treatises spread techniques beyond regional boundaries. Manuals on perspective, anatomy, and architecture circulated among practitioners. Young artists in Northern Europe could study Italian theory without travelling there. At the same time, religious conflict intensified. Wars of religion erupted in parts of Europe during the 16th century. France experienced decades of violence between Catholic and Protestant factions. The Holy Roman Empire faced divisions formalised in the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, allowing rulers to determine the religion of their territories. England's break with Rome under Henry VIII created a national church under royal authority. Subsequent reigns alternated between Protestant and Catholic leadership, reflecting political as well as theological concerns. Printed Bibles in English influenced popular devotion. The Catholic Church responded with renewed artistic patronage. Baroque style emerged in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, emphasizing clarity and engagement. Though stylistically distinct from High Renaissance balance, it built upon earlier foundations. Scientific thought advanced gradually. Tycho Brahe collected astronomical data with precision. Johannes Kepler later formulated laws of planetary motion based on mathematical analysis. Their work depended on printed tables and correspondence networks. Urban life reflected increasing complexity. News sheets reported political developments. Pamphlets debated policy. Literacy rates rose slowly, unevenly across regions, but enough to create a broader reading public. Printing thus served as both instrument and catalyst. It did not create the Renaissance, but it accelerated its spread. Ideas that once required years to travel could now circulate within months. Scholars became part of a republic of letters, connected through printed words. As the 17th century approached, Europe's intellectual landscape bore marks of this transformation. Religious pluralism, scientific debate, and artistic diversity characterized the era. The press stood quietly behind these shifts, multiplying voices. The Renaissance, initially rooted in Italian humanism and artistic experimentation, had become a continent-wide process. It reshaped education, faith, governance, and daily reading habits. Its influence extended beyond elite courts into urban households. By this stage, Europe stood at the threshold of further change. Scientific inquiry would deepen. Political authority would centralize in some regions and fragment in others. Global trade would intensify. The habits formed during the Renaissance, questioning texts, observing nature, cultivating individual expression, would guide these developments. As the 16th century unfolded, the Renaissance could no longer be described as an Italian movement alone. Ideas, styles, and methods that had matured in Florence, Rome, and Venice were now adapting to conditions across northern Europe. The character of this expansion differed from its Italian origins. Climate, religious traditions, and political structures shaped distinct expressions of the same intellectual current. In the Low Countries, prosperous cities such as Antwerp and Bruges benefited from trade networks that connected the North Sea to the Mediterranean. Merchants exchanged textiles, metals, and luxury goods. Urban wealth supported artists who developed techniques rooted in close observation. Oil painting, refined by Jan van Eyck in the early 15th century, allowed subtle gradations of light and texture. Surfaces appeared luminous. Fabrics, metal, and skin reflected light with careful detail. Northern painters approached realism through precision rather than classical proportion. Interiors included objects arranged meticulously: books, candles, fruit, and instruments. Such elements carried symbolic meaning while grounding scenes in everyday life. Portraits presented merchants and civic leaders with quiet dignity. Albrecht Dürer travelled from Nuremberg to Italy in the 1490s, studying perspective and proportion. He recognised that Italian artists relied on mathematical systems to construct space. Upon returning home, he published treatises explaining geometry and human measurement. His engravings circulated widely, bridging northern detail with Italian structure. Humanism also reached the north through scholarship. Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam exemplified this intellectual migration. Educated in monastic and university settings, Erasmus edited and published a new Latin translation of the New Testament based on Greek manuscripts. He advocated moral reform within the Church, emphasizing inner piety and classical learning. His writings travelled across Europe through print, influencing both Catholic and Protestant readers. In England, Thomas More engaged with humanist thought. His work Utopia imagined a fictional society organised by reason and communal responsibility. Though literary in form, it reflected Renaissance interest in classical philosophy and civic ethics. English grammar schools incorporated humanist curricula, teaching Latin rhetoric and classical history. France absorbed Renaissance culture through court patronage. King Francis I invited Italian artists, including Leonardo da Vinci, to reside at his court. French chateaux adopted classical architectural elements, blending them with local traditions. Humanist scholars established printing houses in Paris and Lyon. Spain's Renaissance developed within the context of unification under Ferdinand and Isabella, and the subsequent expansion into the Americas. Wealth from colonial territories financed artistic projects and educational institutions. Universities such as Salamanca incorporated humanist studies alongside theological instruction. The encounter with new continents transformed European awareness. Voyages led by Christopher Columbus in 1492, Vasco da Gama's route to India, and Ferdinand Magellan's circumnavigation expanded geographical knowledge. Printed maps incorporated these discoveries. Trade introduced unfamiliar plants, animals, and commodities. Tomatoes, potatoes, and maize gradually entered European diets. Global exchange influenced economics. Silver from the Americas increased European monetary supply, contributing to price fluctuations known as the price revolution. Merchant networks expanded further. Cities such as Seville and Lisbon became gateways for overseas trade. Intellectual curiosity extended to natural history. Scholars catalogued newly encountered species. Botanical gardens were established to study imported plants. Collections of artifacts from distant lands filled cabinets of curiosity. precursors to modern museums. Meanwhile, religious tensions continued to shape Northern Europe. In Germany, Lutheran territories restructured church governance. In Switzerland, reform movements led by Huldrych Zwingli and later John Calvin emphasized different theological emphases. Calvin's teachings influenced communities in France, the Netherlands, Scotland, and beyond. These developments affected art. In Protestant regions, religious imagery declined in churches due to concerns about idolatry. Artists redirected attention toward portraiture, landscape, and genre scenes. In Catholic territories, the Counter-Reformation encouraged clear narrative art that reinforced doctrine. Architecture evolved differently in various regions. In England, classical elements appeared gradually within Tudor structures. In Spain, the Plateresque style combined Renaissance ornament with local traditions. Germany developed its own variations, blending Gothic and classical forms. Education broadened further. Protestant communities established schools to promote literacy for Bible reading. Catholic reformers expanded seminaries and colleges. Universities incorporated new scientific and philosophical discussions while retaining traditional subjects. Scientific inquiry accelerated in the late 16th century. Observational astronomy advanced through improved instruments. Galileo's telescopic discoveries revealed lunar craters and Jupiter's moons, challenging Aristotelian cosmology. Though controversy followed, his findings circulated widely. Philosophical debate deepened. Thinkers questioned inherited frameworks and explored empirical methods. Francis Bacon in England advocated systematic observation and experimentation. Though his work belongs partly to the 17th century, it emerged from Renaissance confidence in human inquiry. Literature flourished in vernacular languages. In England, William Shakespeare's plays combined classical themes with contemporary concerns. His works reflected Renaissance interest in character, political ambition, and moral complexity. In Spain, Miguel de Cervantes published Don Quixote, blending satire with reflection on chivalric ideals. Music developed polyphonic richness. Composers such as Palestrina in Rome structured sacred compositions with clarity suited to Counter-Reformation ideals. Secular madrigals spread across courts and households, combining poetry with layered harmony. Daily life in Northern Europe incorporated Renaissance influences gradually. Merchants displayed imported goods. Homes included printed books and decorative objects inspired by classical motifs. Clothing styles adapted Italian fashions within local climates. By the early 17th century, the Renaissance spirit had permeated much of Europe. Yet it did not eliminate regional identity. Instead, it provided shared references, classical texts, perspective theory, humanist education that each society interpreted differently. The movement's expansion also prepared the ground for further transformation. Scientific revolution, religious conflict, and political centralization would reshape Europe in the coming decades. The Renaissance had encouraged study of antiquity and observation of nature. These habits would guide thinkers beyond the framework of the 15th century. What began as a revival of classical learning in Italian city-states had become a continental shift in how knowledge was gathered, art was created, and authority was questioned. Through trade routes, printing presses, courts, and universities, Renaissance ideas moved steadily outward. As Renaissance ideas spread across Europe, they entered courts and governments where power was being reorganized. The political landscape of the 16th century differed markedly from that of the fragmented medieval past. Monarchies in France, Spain, and England strengthened administrative systems. Diplomacy became more formalized. Written correspondence, often shaped by humanist rhetoric, structured negotiations between states. Italy remained divided and vulnerable to foreign intervention. The Italian Wars, beginning in 1494, involved France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and various Italian states. Armies moved repeatedly across the peninsula. Cities were besieged and alliances shifted. The instability revealed the limits of small republics facing centralized monarchies. Niccolò Machiavelli, a Florentine diplomat and political thinker, observed these changes closely. After serving the Republic in various missions, he experienced exile when the Medici returned to power. During this period, he wrote The Prince, a short treatise analysing how rulers acquire and maintain authority. His work emphasised pragmatic calculation rather than moral idealism. He studied Roman history and contemporary politics, arguing that stability required decisiveness and adaptability. Machiavelli's ideas reflected Renaissance engagement with classical sources while addressing modern realities. He examined human behaviour as it functioned in politics, not merely as it ought to function. Though controversial, his analysis contributed to emerging concepts of statecraft grounded in observation. Elsewhere in Europe, monarchs consolidated power through bureaucratic systems. In Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella unified territories and strengthened royal institutions. Their successors extended administrative reach into overseas colonies. The flow of silver from the Americas increased royal revenue, though it also contributed to economic strain through inflation. France, under Francis I and his successors, developed centralised courts. Royal patronage of art reinforced authority. Legal reforms sought to standardise administration across provinces. Diplomacy relied increasingly on resident ambassadors, reflecting Renaissance emphasis on communication and negotiation. England experienced its own transformations. Henry VIII's break with Rome in the 1530s transferred ecclesiastical authority to the crown. The dissolution of monasteries redistributed land and wealth, strengthening royal control. Under Elizabeth I, England balanced religious compromise with cultural flowering, supporting literature and exploration. The Holy Roman Empire remained a mosaic of principalities and free cities. The Reformation fragmented religious unity, formalised by the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. Local rulers gained authority to determine religious practice within their territories. Political identity intertwined with confessional allegiance. Diplomatic correspondence during this era reflected humanist education. Letters were composed in polished Latin or increasingly refined vernacular languages. Rhetorical skill enhanced political credibility. Education in classical history provided models for governance and civic virtue. Urban governments also adapted. Councils recorded decisions systematically. Financial administration became more organised. Taxation supported standing armies rather than temporary feudal levies. Military technology evolved with the introduction of gunpowder artillery, altering fortification design. The development of new fortifications known as Tres Italienne demonstrated Renaissance engineering applied to defence. Star-shaped bastions replaced medieval walls, designed to withstand cannon fire. Architects and engineers collaborated in planning cities capable of resisting siege warfare. Commerce influenced political decisions. Merchant interests shaped foreign policy. Control of trade routes became strategic priority. Venice guarded its maritime empire carefully, while Portugal and Spain competed for overseas dominance. Intellectual exchange intersected with politics. Scholars served as advisors and secretaries. Universities educated administrators capable of managing expanding bureaucracies. Printing allowed rapid dissemination of political arguments, shaping public opinion. The concept of sovereignty evolved gradually. Thinkers such as Jean Bodin in France articulated theories of centralized authority. His writings examine the nature of power within a state, emphasizing unity as protection against internal conflict. Religious wars in France between Catholic and Huguenot factions revealed the dangers of fragmentation. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572 shocked observers across Europe. Political leaders sought stability amid confessional division. In the Netherlands, resistance against Spanish rule combined economic grievances with Protestant identity. The Dutch revolt eventually produced an independent republic in the north. Amsterdam emerged as a commercial centre, benefiting from maritime trade and relative religious tolerance. The Renaissance's influence on politics did not eliminate violence or rivalry. Instead, it provided tools for analysis and administration. Classical texts informed discussions of republicanism and empire. Humanist education trained officials capable of navigating complex alliances. Civic identity remained significant in Italian cities, though overshadowed by foreign domination. Florence experienced shifts between Medici rule and republican governance. Rome, rebuilt under successive popes, combined spiritual authority with territorial ambition. Art continued to serve political ends. Portraits projected royal dignity. Public monuments celebrated victories. Architectural projects symbolized centralized strength. Courts displayed cultural refinement as evidence of legitimacy. Economic change accelerated. The expansion of Atlantic trade shifted Europe's center of gravity toward western seaboard nations. Ports such as Lisbon, Seville, and later Amsterdam gained prominence. Mediterranean cities adjusted to altered trade patterns. Agricultural production faced pressures from population growth and climatic fluctuation. The late 16th century saw episodes of poor harvest linked to cooler temperatures. Governments responded with grain storage policies and price controls where possible. Intellectual life reflected these tensions. Debates about governance, law, and religion filled printed pages. Pamphlets circulated arguments supporting or criticizing rulers. Political awareness expanded beyond narrow elites. By the early 17th century, the Renaissance phase of political transformation blended into early modern state formation. Administrative systems were more complex. Armies were larger and more permanent. Diplomacy was continuous rather than episodic. The intellectual habits cultivated during the Renaissance, critical reading, classical comparison, rhetorical skill, proved adaptable to governance. They did not guarantee justice or peace, but they shaped how leaders conceptualized authority. Europe now consisted of emerging nation-states, competing empires, and resilient republics. The Italian city-states that had nurtured early humanism no longer dominated political events, yet the frameworks they developed influenced broader structures. The Renaissance had begun with scholars rediscovering ancient texts. It now contributed to the machinery of modern politics. Letters, laws, fortifications, and fiscal systems bore its imprint. As the 17th century approached, Europe stood prepared for further upheaval, religious wars on continental scale, scientific revolutions, and colonial expansion. The political culture formed during the Renaissance would frame these developments, even as new challenges reshaped the continent once more. As political systems evolved and printing accelerated communication, Renaissance thought increasingly turned toward the natural world. Curiosity that had once focused on classical manuscripts now expanded into observation of the heavens, the human body, and the physical laws governing motion. This transition did not reject earlier scholarship. Rather, it built upon humanist methods of returning to original sources and testing established interpretations. Astronomy became one of the first fields to reflect this shift clearly. For centuries, European understanding of the cosmos had been shaped by the Ptolemaic system, which placed Earth at the center of a series of nested spheres. This geocentric model had been refined through medieval commentary and integrated into theological frameworks. Yet discrepancies between predicted and observed planetary movements troubled some scholars. Nicolaus Copernicus, born in 1473 inches what is now Poland, studied mathematics and astronomy in Italy. After years of calculation, he proposed that the Sun, not the Earth, occupied the center of the planetary system. His book, De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, published in 1543, outlined this heliocentric arrangement. Copernicus dedicated the work to Pope Paul III, reflecting the complex relationship between scientific inquiry and religious authority. The heliocentric model did not immediately overturn established cosmology. Its mathematical elegance appealed to some, while others regarded it cautiously. The book circulated among specialists rather than the general public. Still, it introduced a framework that would influence later generations. Advances in observation strengthened this process. Tycho Brahe, a Danish nobleman, constructed observatories and recorded planetary positions with remarkable precision. Though he did not fully accept heliocentrism, his data provided a foundation for further analysis. Johannes Kepler, who later worked with Brahe's records, formulated laws describing planetary motion in elliptical orbits. His conclusions relied on mathematical relationships rather than circular perfection. Galileo Galilei, an Italian mathematician, improved the telescope in the early 17th century. Through it, he observed mountains on the Moon, phases of Venus, and moons orbiting Jupiter. These findings challenged the assumption that all celestial bodies revolved around Earth. Galileo published his results in accessible language, reaching a wider audience than previous astronomical works. The Church initially responded with caution rather than immediate condemnation. However, as heliocentrism gained public attention and appeared to contradict certain scriptural interpretations, tension increased. Galileo's trial in 1633 marked a moment when scientific method and ecclesiastical authority confronted one another directly. Though forced to recant publicly, his work continued to circulate. Anatomy also advanced during this period. Andreas Vesalius, born in Brussels in 1514, conducted systematic dissections that corrected errors inherited from ancient authorities such as Galen. His book De Humani Corporis Fabrica presented detailed illustrations of the human body. These images, produced with artistic precision, demonstrated how Renaissance art and science intersected. The study of musculature and bone structure informed both medicine and sculpture. William Harvey in England later described the circulation of blood, building upon anatomical knowledge accumulated during the Renaissance. His experiments relied on direct observation and quantitative reasoning. Natural philosophy broadened beyond astronomy and anatomy. Scholars investigated magnetism, mechanics, and optics. Instruments such as microscopes and improved lenses expanded the scale of observation. Though many conclusions would later be revised, the method of inquiry shifted toward experimentation and measurement. This scientific transformation was gradual and uneven. Universities retained traditional curricula alongside new studies. Aristotelian philosophy remained influential, yet a space had opened for questioning and revision. Printing remained essential to this process. Scientific treatises included diagrams and tables reproducible across Europe. Correspondence networks allowed scholars to compare results. The Republic of Letters, as it was sometimes called, connected thinkers from different regions through shared curiosity. Renaissance education had emphasized rhetoric and classical history. Now, mathematics gained increasing importance. Geometry, once primarily a tool for artists and architects, became central to scientific reasoning. Calculations replaced purely qualitative descriptions. Philosophical reflection accompanied empirical work. René Descartes in France sought systematic doubt as a path to certainty. His approach emphasized reason as foundation for knowledge. Though his philosophy extended beyond the Renaissance period, it emerged from intellectual currents shaped by earlier humanist inquiry. The relationship between science and religion during this era was complex. Many scientists remained devout. They viewed study of nature as understanding divine creation. Conflicts arose not from simple opposition but from differing interpretations of authority and evidence. Technological innovation influenced daily life gradually. Improved navigation techniques supported long-distance voyages. Advances in metallurgy strengthened artillery and tools. Agricultural practices adapted to new crops introduced from overseas. The Renaissance habit of returning to original sources extended to biblical scholarship as well. Scholars examined Hebrew and Greek texts to refine translations. This textual analysis paralleled scientific scrutiny of inherited cosmologies. By the early 17th century, the cumulative effect of these investigations reshaped European thought. The cosmos appeared less fixed and more dynamic. The human body became an object of systematic study. Knowledge seemed expandable rather than closed. This transformation did not erase tradition immediately. Religious institutions continued to shape education and governance. Yet intellectual confidence in observation and calculation marked a departure from medieval reliance on commentary alone. Art and science remained intertwined. Anatomical drawings informed painters, geometric perspective informed astronomers, shared interest in proportion and structure linked disciplines. As political tensions mounted toward the 30 Years' War beginning in 1618, Europe entered a period of extended conflict. Yet even amid warfare, scientific exchange persisted. Scholars corresponded across confessional lines. The Renaissance had begun with rediscovery of classical antiquity. It matured into a culture that valued inquiry across multiple fields. The scientific developments of this era would later be labelled the Scientific Revolution, but their roots lay in habits formed during the Renaissance: critical reading, careful observation, and willingness to revise inherited models. While scholars measured planets and dissected bodies, European ships were crossing oceans with increasing regularity. The Renaissance had encouraged curiosity about classical geography, yet ancient maps described only a limited world. Mariners of the 15th and 16th centuries gradually replaced inherited outlines with first-hand observation. Exploration reshaped economic structures and intellectual assumptions alike. Portuguese voyages along the west coast of Africa during the 15th century marked an early stage of this outward movement. Supported by Prince Henry the Navigator, expeditions sought trade routes that bypassed established Mediterranean intermediaries. Caravels, designed for ocean travel, allowed sailors to navigate unfamiliar waters. By 1498, Vasco da Gama reached India by rounding the Cape of Good Hope, establishing a sea route linking Europe directly to Asian markets. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed west under Spanish patronage, aiming to reach Asia across the Atlantic. Instead, he encountered lands unknown to Europeans. Subsequent voyages revealed that these territories formed continents previously uncharted in European geography. The term New World entered circulation, reflecting both novelty and misunderstanding. The consequences were extensive. Spanish expeditions under Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro conquered large indigenous empires in Mexico and Peru. These conquests, facilitated by military technology and disease, brought vast quantities of silver to Europe. Colonial administration followed, integrating overseas territories into European political systems. Portugal established trading posts in Africa, India, and later Brazil. Spanish and Portuguese spheres of influence were formalized through treaties dividing overseas claims. Other European powers would soon challenge this dominance. The influx of silver altered European economies. Increased monetary supply contributed to sustained price inflation during the 16th century. Wages did not always keep pace, affecting urban labourers and rural peasants differently. Governments adapted fiscal policies to manage new revenue streams. Trade networks expanded dramatically. Spices from Asia, sugar from Caribbean plantations, and textiles from distant markets flowed into European ports. Seville and Lisbon prospered as gateways. Antwerp became a commercial hub connecting northern and southern trade routes. Cultural exchange accompanied economic transformation. European scholars examined unfamiliar plants, animals, and peoples. Reports from missionaries and travellers circulated in printed accounts. Curiosity about distant lands aligned with Renaissance interest in geography and natural history. However, exploration also intensified systems of exploitation. The transatlantic slave trade expanded to meet labour demands in colonial plantations. African societies were drawn into global networks shaped by European demand. These developments had enduring human consequences. Cartography advanced alongside navigation. Maps incorporated newly charted coastlines. Gerardus Mercator's projection in 1569 offered a practical system for sailors, though it distorted scale at higher latitudes. Printed atlases allowed merchants and officials to visualize expanding empires. The expansion of European presence overseas influenced domestic politics. Colonial wealth strengthened monarchies but also generated competition. Naval power became a measure of state capacity. England and the Netherlands invested in maritime fleets to challenge Iberian dominance. Religious missions accompanied exploration. Catholic and Protestant missionaries sought converts in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Educational institutions and churches were established in colonial territories. The spread of Christianity intertwined with political control. Back in Europe, imported goods altered consumption patterns. Sugar, once rare, became more common. Tobacco spread rapidly after its introduction. Chocolate and coffee entered European diets gradually. These commodities influenced social habits and commercial enterprise. Scientific interest in navigation stimulated mathematical study. Accurate measurement of longitude remained difficult, but improved instruments such as the astrolabe and later the sextant advanced maritime precision. Shipbuilding techniques evolved to accommodate longer voyages. Renaissance humanism had encouraged admiration for ancient explorers such as Ptolemy. Now, contemporary navigators surpassed classical knowledge. The world described by antiquity proved incomplete. European self-understanding adjusted accordingly. Colonial encounters also raised moral and philosophical questions. Bartolomé de las Casas criticized the treatment of indigenous peoples, arguing for their humanity and rights. Debates within Spain addressed the ethics of conquest and governance. Economic centers shifted westward as Atlantic trade surpassed Mediterranean routes in importance. Italian city-states, once dominant in commerce, faced competition from ports along the Atlantic coast. Amsterdam in the 17th century emerged as a financial and maritime powerhouse. Joint stock companies formed to distribute risk among investors. The Dutch East India Company and the English East India Company operated as commercial enterprises with quasi-governmental authority overseas. These institutions represented new forms of economic organization. The Renaissance emphasis on classical revival did not disappear amid global expansion. Instead, it provided intellectual tools for interpreting new realities. Scholars compared indigenous societies to ancient civilizations. Classical references framed descriptions of unfamiliar customs. At the same time, knowledge flowed in multiple directions. European crops and animals transformed American landscapes. American plants reshaped European agriculture. Global exchange became reciprocal, though uneven in power. Urban life reflected these changes. Warehouses stored imported goods. Financial markets handled transactions linked to overseas trade. Insurance practices developed to manage maritime risk. Exploration also influenced imagination. Travel narratives described distant wonders, fueling curiosity and ambition. Cartographic images decorated books and walls, reinforcing awareness of global scale. As the 17th century approached, Europe's connection to the wider world had become permanent. Maritime routes linked continents in sustained exchange. Political rivalries extended overseas. The Renaissance had begun as a cultural rebirth rooted in classical antiquity. Now it intersected with global transformation. European societies were no longer confined to familiar boundaries. Commerce, migration, and conquest reshaped demographics and economies. These developments would contribute to further political and intellectual shifts. The habits of inquiry and calculation cultivated during the Renaissance proved essential in managing expanding empires and complex trade systems. As Europe's horizons expanded across oceans, life within its cities and towns continued to evolve in quieter but equally meaningful ways. The Renaissance was not only visible in courts, studios, and observatories. It unfolded in kitchens, workshops, classrooms, and parish churches, shaping habits and expectations across generations. Urban growth marked one of the clearest changes between the 14th and 17th centuries. Cities such as Florence, Venice, Paris, London, and Antwerp expanded in population. Migration from rural areas brought labourers seeking opportunity. Narrow medieval streets gradually gave way, in some districts, to planned squares and improved public buildings. Markets remained central to daily rhythm. Early each morning, vendors arranged vegetables, grains, fish, and meat on wooden stalls. Bakers prepared loaves in communal ovens. Butchers displayed cuts according to guild regulations. Municipal authorities inspected goods to maintain standards and prevent fraud. Public trust in trade was essential to urban stability. Guild membership structured professional identity. Artisans belonged to associations that regulated training, quality, and pricing. Apprenticeships formalized the transition from childhood to adulthood. A young apprentice entered a master's household, learning both craft and discipline. Years of practice preceded advancement to journeyman status and eventual mastery. Women participated actively in economic life, though often within constraints. In artisan families, wives contributed to production and managed accounts. Widows sometimes inherited workshops and continued operations. In markets, women sold produce and textiles. Yet legal rights varied by region, and formal political participation remained limited. Education expanded beyond elite circles during this period. Urban schools taught reading, writing, and arithmetic. In Protestant regions, literacy gained importance for Bible study. Catholic reformers also invested in schooling through new religious orders, printed textbooks, standardized instruction. The ability to read became increasingly valuable for commerce and administration. Family structure emphasized kinship networks. Marriages linked households strategically. Dowries reflected economic status. Birth and mortality rates remained high compared to later centuries. Epidemics returned intermittently, though medical understanding improved gradually. Food culture reflected both continuity and change. Traditional grains remained staples, yet imported products diversified diets. Sugar-sweetened desserts once reserved for the wealthy. Coffee houses emerged in the late 17th century, particularly in Ottoman-influenced regions and later in Western Europe. These establishments became spaces for conversation and news. Clothing styles shifted over time. Italian fashions influenced Northern Europe, though climate-shaped adaptation. Layered garments and decorative embroidery signaled prosperity. Sumptuary laws attempted to regulate excess. Though enforcement varied, domestic interiors changed gradually. Wealthier households displayed tapestries, paintings, and printed books. Furniture grew more specialized: tables for writing, cabinets for storing documents, beds enclosed with curtains for warmth. Decorative objects reflected global trade, including porcelain and exotic woods. Entertainment included seasonal festivals, theatre performances, and music. Public celebrations marked religious holidays and civic events. Travelling performers brought stories and acrobatics to marketplaces. Printed ballads circulated popular songs. Literacy fostered new forms of leisure. People read devotional texts, romances, and news pamphlets. Reading often occurred aloud within families or social groups. The printed word encouraged private reflection as well as public debate. Health practices combined traditional remedies with emerging medical knowledge. Herbal treatments remained common. University-trained physicians served wealthier clients. Hospitals in urban centres provided limited care for the poor. Legal systems became more structured. Written contracts governed business transactions. Courts recorded proceedings systematically. Documentation increased in volume and importance, reflecting administrative complexity. The Renaissance also influenced attitudes toward childhood and education. Humanist educators emphasized moral development and civic responsibility. Textbooks presented classical exemplars as models of virtue. Social hierarchy persisted, yet mobility existed within limits. Successful merchants accumulated wealth and purchased land. Noble families sought alliances with prosperous urban households. Status markers remained visible in architecture, clothing, and ceremony. Religious practice retained central place in community life. Church bells structured daily routine. Baptisms, marriages, and funerals marked life stages. In Protestant regions, sermons emphasized scriptural study. In Catholic territories, visual art reinforced devotional focus. Urban planning responded to both growth and defense needs. New fortifications incorporated angled bastions suited to gunpowder warfare. Streets were sometimes widened to improve circulation. Public fountains supplied water. The rhythm of work varied by occupation. Craftsmen laboured long hours in workshops illuminated by natural light. Merchants kept detailed ledgers. Sailors spent months at sea. Agricultural workers followed seasonal cycles. Global trade influenced local economies unevenly. Port cities benefited from maritime commerce. Inland towns relied on regional markets. Economic disparities could widen during periods of inflation or poor harvest. Intellectual exchange filtered gradually into daily conversation. Pamphlets debated politics and religion. News sheets reported distant events. Awareness of broader European affairs increased among literate populations. By the early 17th century, Europe's social fabric reflected centuries of gradual adjustment. Renaissance influence was visible not only in monumental art but in habits of reading, accounting, and conversation. The period did not eliminate hardship. Poverty, disease, and conflict remained present. Yet opportunities for education, trade, and artistic participation expanded relative to earlier centuries. The Renaissance had encouraged attention to human experience in all its dimensions. This attention extended beyond philosophical treatises into lived routines. Markets, households, and schools became part of the broader transformation. As Europe moved toward further political and scientific change, daily life carried forward Renaissance habits, curiosity, literacy, and structured organization. These practices would support the developments of the 17th century and beyond. The world shaped during these centuries combined tradition with innovation. Ancient texts coexisted with printed pamphlets. Guild workshops operated alongside expanding global companies. Parish rituals continued, even as scientific instruments redefined the cosmos. The Renaissance thus permeated society gradually, embedding itself in routines that seemed ordinary to those who lived them. Through countless small adjustments in work, diet, education, and belief, Europe entered a new stage of cultural maturity. As the 17th century approached, the Renaissance did not simply fade. Instead, it began to transform into something more structured and, in some regions, more restrained. The habits it had cultivated, critical reading, artistic balance, scientific inquiry, civic administration, remained active. Yet Europe now faced sustained religious conflict and prolonged warfare that reshaped priorities. The 30 Years' War, beginning in 1618 within the Holy Roman Empire, emerged from tensions between Protestant and Catholic states. What began as a regional dispute widened into a continental conflict involving Sweden, France, Spain, and numerous German principalities. Armies moved repeatedly across Central Europe. Populations suffered from both battle and famine. Economic disruption affected towns and countryside alike. Despite the violence, intellectual exchange did not cease. Universities continued teaching. Printing presses operated where possible. Scholars corresponded across confessional boundaries. The resilience of these networks reflected institutional strength built during the Renaissance. Political authority consolidated further in several regions. France, under Louis XIII and later Louis XIV, developed a centralized monarchy supported by administrative officials known as intendants. Royal control over taxation and military forces increased. Court culture became a visible instrument of power, with architecture and ceremony reinforcing hierarchy. In England, tensions between monarchy and parliament intensified. Debates about sovereignty and religious practice culminated in civil war in the 1640s. Though these events belong partly to the early modern era, their intellectual background rested in Renaissance political thought and humanist education. The Dutch Republic, having secured independence from Spain, established a commercial state grounded in maritime trade. Amsterdam flourished as a financial centre. Religious tolerance, though not absolute, allowed diverse communities to coexist. This environment supported printing, philosophy, and art. Scientific inquiry continued advancing. Galileo's earlier observations influenced subsequent thinkers. René Descartes proposed analytic geometry and philosophical systems, emphasizing rational method. His approach reflected confidence in mathematical clarity. Meanwhile, Isaac Newton's work later in the 17th century would integrate earlier astronomical discoveries into a comprehensive theory of motion and gravitation. Though Newton's achievements lie beyond the Renaissance proper, they emerge from intellectual groundwork laid in preceding centuries. Artistic style shifted as well. The balanced harmony of the High Renaissance gave way to Baroque dynamism. Caravaggio introduced dramatic contrasts of light and shadow, emphasizing realism and emotional immediacy. Gian Lorenzo Bernini's sculptures conveyed movement within marble, capturing moments of action rather than static equilibrium. These developments responded partly to the Catholic Church's desire for clear, persuasive imagery during the Counter-Reformation. In Northern Europe, painters such as Rembrandt and Vermeer depicted domestic interiors and individual portraits with quiet observation. Their works reflected Protestant culture's emphasis on private devotion and civic identity, rather than grand ecclesiastical commissions. Economic structures adapted to prolonged warfare and global trade. Banking systems became more sophisticated. Insurance markets expanded. Governments borrowed extensively to finance armies. Public debt emerged as a central feature of statecraft. Education continued evolving. Universities incorporated new scientific texts alongside classical curricula. Grammar schools maintained emphasis on rhetoric and Latin, ensuring continuity of humanist tradition. Literacy rates improved gradually, especially in urban centres. The Renaissance legacy also shaped legal thought. Codification of laws and development of legal scholarship reflected commitment to systematic analysis. Roman law, rediscovered and studied earlier, influenced continental legal systems. Intellectual debate increasingly valued evidence and experiment. The founding of scientific societies in the 17th century, such as the Royal Society in England, institutionalized inquiry. Members conducted experiments, recorded observations, and published findings. This formal organization of knowledge grew directly from Renaissance habits of collaboration and documentation. Meanwhile, colonial expansion continued reshaping Europe's economy and demography. Atlantic trade networks intensified. Plantation systems in the Americas expanded, relying heavily on enslaved labor. European consumption of sugar, tobacco, and coffee increased. Urban centers reflected new wealth and new inequalities. Grand avenues and public buildings signaled confidence in some capitals. At the same time, poverty remained visible among laboring populations. Religious plurality became a permanent feature in parts of Europe. The Peace of Westphalia, in 1648, recognized the coexistence of multiple confessions within the Holy Roman Empire. This settlement marked a turning point in international relations, emphasizing state sovereignty. By the late 17th century, Europe's intellectual culture bore marks of continuity and innovation. Classical texts remained foundational in education. Yet, new scientific frameworks redefined natural philosophy. Political theory addressed emerging nation-states rather than small republics alone. The Renaissance, viewed from this later vantage point, appears less as a discrete era and more as a gradual shift in orientation. It redirected attention toward classical antiquity, human experience, and empirical observation. These tendencies persisted even as artistic styles and political structures evolved. Daily life in Europe now incorporated printed materials routinely. Newspapers began appearing regularly in the 17th century. Information circulated more widely than ever before. Public opinion gained subtle influence. The transformation begun in 14th century Italy had extended across continents and centuries. It survived war, religious division, and economic fluctuation. Its institutions, universities, printing houses, bureaucracies, academies proved durable. As the Baroque era unfolded, some observers later contrasted its dynamism with Renaissance balance, yet both belonged to a continuous trajectory. The Renaissance had established the conditions under which later developments could occur. By the end of the 17th century, Europe was firmly within what historians call the early modern period. The world had grown larger, political systems more centralized, scientific knowledge more systematic. The Renaissance did not disappear. It matured into frameworks that shaped Enlightenment thought and beyond. Its achievements lay not only in masterpieces of art or treatises on philosophy, but in altered habits of thinking. Europeans increasingly expected that texts could be questioned, that nature could be measured, and that governance could be analysed. The era that began with Petrarch's admiration for classical letters had reshaped education, politics, science, commerce, and daily routine. Its legacy endured because it embedded itself in institutions rather than remaining a fleeting cultural fashion. By now, the Renaissance had fulfilled its quiet work. It had carried Europe from medieval inheritance toward modern structure. What followed would build upon foundations carefully laid across 3 centuries of gradual change. By the late 17th century, Europeans no longer described themselves as living in a rebirth. The language of renewal had belonged to earlier generations who believed they were recovering lost brilliance from Greece and Rome. Yet the habits shaped during those centuries remained embedded in institutions, routines, and expectations. The Renaissance had become less a movement and more a foundation. Universities across Europe still taught classical languages as the basis of education. Students translated Cicero and Virgil not simply to admire style, but to train reasoning and clarity. Legal scholars examined Roman law as framework for contemporary systems. Physicians referenced ancient authorities while integrating newer anatomical discoveries. The dialogue between past and present persisted. Libraries that had begun as private collections under Medici patronage expanded into public repositories. Manuscripts once rare were now catalogued and preserved systematically. Printed books filled shelves in increasing numbers. Scholars relied on reference works, indexes, and standardized editions to navigate growing bodies of knowledge. Urban governments, shaped during Renaissance civic reform, operated through written statutes and recorded proceedings. Bureaucracies relied on documentation and archiving. Taxation systems and commercial regulations reflected administrative sophistication that had developed gradually since the 15th century. Artistic academies formalized training in drawing, anatomy, and classical composition. Students copied ancient sculptures as exercises in proportion. Architectural treatises continued circulating, ensuring that classical orders remained reference points even as stylistic variations emerged. Scientific societies institutionalized inquiry. Meetings recorded experiments and observations. Publications shared results across borders. The expectation that claims should be supported by evidence had become widely accepted among scholars. While disagreements persisted, method replaced mere authority as justification. The global networks established during Renaissance exploration expanded further. Colonies grew in scale and complexity. Trade routes connected Europe with Africa, Asia, and the Americas in sustained exchange. Commodities such as tea, coffee, and tobacco became integrated into daily life. Financial systems adapted to manage international investment and credit. Urban centres reflected these connections visibly. Ports displayed goods from distant lands. Coffee houses became venues for discussion of politics, literature, and science. Newspapers reported events beyond national boundaries. Public awareness extended further than in earlier centuries. Religious diversity remained a defining feature in many regions. After decades of conflict, pragmatic tolerance developed in certain states to maintain stability. Confessional identity continued shaping communities, yet coexistence became more common in commercial centres. Education reached broader segments of society. Literacy rates rose gradually, though unevenly across regions. Reading moved from communal recitation toward private engagement. Diaries and personal correspondence increased, reflecting strengthened sense of individual perspective. Family life maintained traditional structures while adapting to economic change. Urban households often combined living and working spaces. Apprenticeship persisted as path to skilled employment. Rural communities continued agricultural routines shaped by seasonal rhythms. The Renaissance's emphasis on civic participation influenced later political thought. Writers examined the balance between monarchy and representative institutions. Discussions about rights and governance drew indirectly upon classical precedents revived centuries earlier. The artistic heritage of the Renaissance became a benchmark for excellence. Later generations studied Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael as models of mastery. Their works were preserved and displayed as exemplars rather than contemporary experiments. The architectural achievements of the period endured physically. Domes, courtyards, and palaces defined city skylines. These structures outlived their original patrons, serving new functions as governments and societies evolved. Economic transformation accelerated into the 18th century. Commercial capitalism expanded. Banking houses operated internationally. Insurance systems and stock exchanges managed financial risk. The Renaissance had prepared Europe for this complexity by encouraging calculation and documentation. Double-entry bookkeeping, refined in Italian merchant houses, became universal practice. Accounting skills were taught systematically. Scientific progress built upon Renaissance observation. Newton's Principia, published in 1687, synthesized earlier discoveries into laws of motion and gravity. Though belonging to a later generation, Newton's work depended on mathematical and empirical methods cultivated earlier. Philosophers increasingly separated natural philosophy from theology, though many retained religious belief. Inquiry into human society and governance developed alongside natural science. The arts diversified. Opera emerged in Italy at the turn of the 17th century, blending music, theatre, and classical themes. This form reflected Renaissance interest in antiquity, while introducing new performance traditions. Public spaces changed as well. Gardens designed with geometric precision embodied ideals of order and symmetry inherited from Renaissance planning. Later landscape designs would modify these principles, yet classical influence remained visible. Historical consciousness deepened. Scholars began writing comprehensive histories of nations and regions. Archives preserved official documents systematically. A sense of temporal progression, antiquity, medieval period, Renaissance, and beyond became embedded in European thought. By the 18th century, thinkers of the Enlightenment would explicitly credit earlier centuries for reopening paths of inquiry. They built upon Renaissance philology, science, and political analysis while pursuing further reform. The Renaissance thus functioned as bridge between medieval inheritance and modern structure. It did not abolish faith, monarchy, or tradition. Instead, it recalibrated their relationship with knowledge and art. In households across Europe, ordinary routines carried traces of this transformation. Printed books rested on shelves, calendars standardized timekeeping, maps depicted continents accurately, contracts governed trade. These were quiet signs of lasting change. The era that had begun with renewed attention to ancient texts concluded by embedding systematic inquiry into European life. Its legacy extended beyond paintings and palaces into the habits of reading, measuring, recording, and debating. As Europe entered the modern age, it did so with tools shaped by centuries of gradual refinement. The Renaissance had not promised perfection. It had encouraged engagement with history, with nature, with governance. The world that followed would confront new challenges, yet it would address them with methods and institutions forged during this long period of transformation. Looking back across the long arc from the 14th to the 17th century, it becomes clear that the Renaissance did not replace the medieval world overnight, nor did it produce a single unified culture. It unfolded unevenly, moved at different speeds in different places, and adapted itself to changing political and religious conditions. Yet by the time Europe stood on the threshold of the 18th century, the transformation was unmistakable. In 1300, most Europeans lived in small rural communities governed by feudal obligation and guided intellectually by theological authority. By 1700, Europe contained large administratively organized states, urban centers connected by global trade, and institutions dedicated to systematic inquiry. The shift was gradual, built from countless decisions made by merchants, artists, scholars, rulers, and labourers. One of the most lasting changes was the repositioning of knowledge. Medieval scholarship had valued commentary on inherited texts. Renaissance humanists insisted on returning to original sources. That habit of comparison and correction extended from classical literature to biblical scholarship, and eventually to scientific observation. The authority of tradition did not disappear, but it faced continual examination. The idea of progress, however cautiously expressed, began to take root. Humanists believed they could improve their own age by studying antiquity. Scientists later believed they could refine understanding by testing inherited models. This confidence in cumulative learning marked a departure from static conceptions of knowledge. Artistic production also reflected this reorientation. The development of perspective, anatomy, and proportion was not merely technical innovation. It signalled belief that the visible world could be studied and represented accurately. Even when later styles departed from Renaissance balance, they did so within a framework that valued observation and technique. Political systems evolved alongside intellectual change. City-states nurtured early humanism, but centralized monarchies eventually absorbed Renaissance administrative practices. Diplomacy became professionalized. Legal codes were recorded systematically. Written governance replaced purely customary rule in many regions. Economic transformation connected Europe to wider networks. Maritime exploration expanded markets and introduced new commodities. Banking practices refined in Italian cities spread across the continent. Commercial capitalism took firmer root. Religious upheaval during the Reformation and Counter-Reformation altered Europe's confessional map permanently. Yet even religious debate demonstrated Renaissance influence. Arguments relied on textual analysis, translation, and printing. Literacy gained renewed importance. Education became broader in scope. Grammar schools taught classical languages not only to clergy, but to merchants and officials. Universities incorporated mathematical and scientific subjects. Intellectual mobility increased as students travelled between institutions. Urban culture matured. Public squares displayed civic monuments. Coffeehouses and salons hosted discussion. Printed newspapers informed citizens of distant events. Awareness extended beyond local boundaries. The Renaissance also altered self-perception. Artists and writers emphasized individual authorship. Patrons sought personal commemoration. Autobiographical writing became more common. The individual emerged more clearly within historical narrative. At the same time, continuity remained evident. Many rural communities maintained traditional agricultural rhythms. Religious devotion remained central to most households. Social hierarchy persisted despite limited mobility. The Renaissance therefore represents not a clean break but a redirection. It adjusted priorities, placing renewed value on classical antiquity, empirical observation, and civic participation. It expanded geographical horizons and intellectual ambition. Its influence endured because it institutionalized change. Printing presses, universities, archives, academies, and bureaucracies preserved and extended its achievements. Even as artistic styles evolved into Baroque and beyond, the underlying habits of inquiry persisted. By the late 17th century, Europe stood more interconnected internally and globally than ever before. Knowledge circulated through books and letters, trade-linked continents. Political authority operated through structured administration. The Renaissance had helped cultivate these conditions. It encouraged disciplined curiosity, systematic organization, and engagement with both past and present. It did not promise harmony, and it did not eliminate conflict. But it provided tools for navigating complexity. When later centuries faced revolution, industrialization, and ideological upheaval, they did so within frameworks shaped by Renaissance thought. The expectation that society could be studied, criticized, and reformed owed much to that earlier transformation. The domes of Florence, the frescoes of Rome, the printed pages of Venice, and the translated texts of Northern Europe stand as visible markers of this long shift. Yet the more enduring legacy lies in habits of mind questioning, comparing, measuring, recording. By the time historians in later centuries gave this long transformation a name, they were already living within its consequences. The Renaissance was not labelled as such by Petrarch or Leonardo. It was identified afterward, when scholars looked back and recognised that something lasting had shifted between the 14th and 17th centuries. Its legacy rests first in education. The humanist curriculum, grammar, rhetoric, history, moral philosophy shaped European schooling for generations. Even when scientific subjects expanded, they entered systems organised by Renaissance principles. The expectation that a well-educated person should read widely, reason clearly, and write persuasively remains rooted in that period. Its legacy rests also in art. The techniques of perspective, anatomical study, and proportional design became foundations of Western artistic training. Museums across the world display works created during those centuries, not merely as historical artifacts, but as standards of craft. The Renaissance established criteria for realism and composition that influenced centuries of painters, sculptors, and architects. In politics, Renaissance thought contributed to the emergence of modern statecraft. The careful analysis of governance found in Machiavelli and later writers encouraged rulers and critics alike to examine power as a practical matter. Diplomatic practice, archival record-keeping, and legal codification all benefited from habits cultivated during that era. In science, the Renaissance prepared the ground for systematic inquiry. By returning to original texts and then moving beyond them through observation, scholars created conditions for the scientific revolution. The method of testing hypotheses, measuring results, and publishing findings grew directly from Renaissance engagement with both classical learning and empirical evidence. The global dimension of Renaissance expansion cannot be overlooked. European exploration reshaped world history permanently. Trade, colonization, cultural exchange, and conflict intertwined continents. While these processes brought opportunity and knowledge, they also carried exploitation and suffering. The Renaissance spirit of curiosity operated within economic and political ambitions that had lasting consequences far beyond Europe. In everyday life, the influence was quieter but equally persistent. Printed books became ordinary possessions. Maps reflected accurate coastlines. Timekeeping grew standardized. Written contracts structured commerce. These practical developments reflected deeper changes in organization and thought. The Renaissance also altered how Europeans understood themselves within history. By distinguishing between antiquity, the medieval period, and their own time, they introduced a layered sense of chronology. This awareness of historical distance allowed for comparison and critique. Religious transformation during the era reshaped communities permanently. Confessional identities became embedded in political structures, yet scholarship and education continued across these divides, often sharing methods if not conclusions. As the early modern period matured into the Enlightenment, many thinkers credited earlier centuries with reopening intellectual possibility. Philosophers such as Voltaire and Montesquieu studied classical history through Renaissance editions. Scientists built upon data gathered by 16th and 17th century observers. Political theorists examined ancient republics through humanist translations. The Renaissance thus stands less as a dramatic awakening and more as a steady recalibration. It encouraged Europeans to examine inherited knowledge, to measure nature carefully, to cultivate artistic skill, and to record governance systematically. Its memory continues shaping modern institutions. Universities trace curricular roots to humanist education. Scientific academies reflect collaborative traditions established in the 17th century. Museums preserve artworks commissioned by Renaissance patrons. Legal systems retain Roman foundations rediscovered and refined during that time. Even the concept of rebirth reveals a shift in historical imagination. It suggests that societies can renew themselves by engaging with their past. That idea of learning from earlier civilizations while adapting to present needs remains influential. As we draw this long journey to a close, it becomes clear that the Renaissance was not confined to Florence or Rome, nor limited to a handful of celebrated names. It was a gradual transformation involving merchants who kept careful accounts, printers who set type by hand, students who memorized Latin verses, sailors who charted new routes, and artisans who experimented with light and stone. It reshaped Europe's relationship to knowledge, art, governance, and the wider world. It bridged medieval inheritance and modern ambition. It unfolded through patient study and practical adaptation rather than sudden upheaval. And now, as the centuries stretch beyond it, the Renaissance remains present in ways that are easy to overlook. In the books that line shelves, in the buildings that anchor city centres, in the expectation that ideas should be examined and tested. The movement that began with scholars searching dusty libraries ended by embedding inquiry into everyday life. Now, as the light grows softer and the details of these centuries settle gently into place, allow the noise of courts and workshops, printing presses and harbour docks to quiet. Imagine the steady rhythm of turning pages in a dimly lit study, the measured tapping of a mason shaping stone, the distant murmur of merchants closing their ledgers for the evening. History does not sleep, but it does grow quiet. Let your thoughts drift across domes and sea routes, across classrooms and marketplaces, knowing that the story of the Renaissance is not only about brilliance, but about steady change.